I'm Erica, and I've always loved love stories where the guy sweeps the girl off her feet. So, when Chris came along with his sweet morning texts and nightly calls asking about my day, I fell for him quickly. Looking back, it's almost funny how fast I thought, this is it. This is love. My friends would see us together and say we were perfect for each other, like we were made to be.
But then there was Grandma Marianne.
She was full of wisdom and had seen so much in her life. She used to say, Erica, honey, watch the signs. When a man wants all your time, it's not always love. Sometimes it's control. I'd laugh it off, thinking her ideas were old-fashioned. Chris was different, or so I thought. One evening, like so many others, we were sitting on my old couch. He held my hand a little too tightly and asked, "Did you meet anyone interesting at work today?" I told him about the usual people and skipped the boring details. It's the same folks every day.
You know that, I said.
He pressed on. And no one knew? No one caught your eye? His tone sounded casual, but his grip wasn't. Why so curious? I asked, trying to joke and gently pulling my hand away. Just making sure we're good, he said, smiling, though his eyes didn't match the smile. We sat there, the TV murmuring in the background, but the mood had shifted. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this quiet pressure, but I always brushed it aside. Grandma Marianne's words came back to me, and my chest tightened. She had warned me about moments like this, but I hadn't really listened. As the night dragged on, my thoughts were far away, caught up in her warnings and the uneasy feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. When Chris left, he took more than himself out the door. He took a piece of my peace with him, leaving me standing there, locking the door behind him. I leaned back and let out a deep breath. The apartment was quiet now, but the doubts in my mind seemed louder in the silence he left behind. I thought about calling Grandma Marianne, but it was late, and I knew this was my mess to figure out. As I stared at the microwave clock blinking in time with my uneasy thoughts, it hit me. There's a thin line between love and being trapped. I had ignored the warnings, thinking the red flags were roses. Chris and I had said "I do" and started our married life in my little ivy-covered house. At first, it seemed perfect, but after we settled in, things started to change. One evening, we were sitting on the porch. The air smelled of pine trees, and Chris held my hand a little too tightly. "Who's that new guy working with you?" he asked suddenly. "Oh, that's just Jeremy. He's in marketing," I said, trying to keep my tone light. Chris didn't say much, just hummed, but I saw the tension in his jaw. I knew that look, it meant he thought something was off. Over time, Chris's questions stopped feeling like questions. They were more like interrogations. He was always trying to find something. Then it wasn't just questions, he started on my clothes. One Friday morning, I was picking out a dress for brunch with friends. "That one's nice," he said, pointing to a plain dress. I was thinking of wearing the blue one. "It's more cheerful," I said, holding on my favorite dress. It was the one that made my eyes sparkle a little more. He shook his head. "You'd stand out too much."
"Wear the other one," he said.
It wasn't a suggestion. "But Chris, it's just a dress," I said, trying to keep the peace. "Trust me, Erica. I'm looking out for you," he replied. But it didn't feel like he was looking out for me.
It felt like he was controlling me.
It didn't stop there. His preferences spilled into everything: my wardrobe, my social life. Dinners with friends became rare, my phone stopped buzzing, and eventually the invitations stopped altogether. One evening, Chris plopped down on the couch beside me, looking annoyed. "Owen called. Wants us to meet them for drinks next Thursday," he said, grabbing the remote. "Oh, that sounds nice," I said, surprised. "Told him we're busy," Chris replied, cutting me off. "We are?" I asked, confused. I hadn't seen Owen and Chelsea in weeks. They were our couple friends, the ones we used to hang out with all the time. Chris flipped through the TV channels, not looking at me. "We don't need to spend so much time with them. You've got me, and I've got you. That's enough, isn't it?" he said. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to argue, to remind him that we were our own people, but I felt too tired to fight. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. That's enough, I said quietly, but it felt like I was trying to convince myself. This was my life now. What I wore and who I spent time with had become things Chris decided. And every time I let it slide, he'd take a little more. I didn't realize how much I'd lost until I found an old photo of myself laughing with friends. I stared at it and wondered where that version of me had gone. Life isn't neat and simple, it's messy, especially when love becomes something that traps you instead of setting you free. That's how it felt with Chris lately. Our love felt like walls closing in, disguised as normal married life. His new habit was showing up at my office without warning, acting like he owned the place, and me, too. Just in the neighborhood, he'd say with an overly cheerful smile. One evening, I decided I'd wear my favorite pencil skirt to work the next day. Chris walked in, his face twisted with anger. I knew what was coming.
Why do you need to wear that? He snapped.
It's just a skirt, Chris, I said, trying to stay calm.
I didn't want another fight.
It's not just a skirt. Who are you dressing for, Huss? His voice was sharp, full of suspicion. I dress for myself. Since when is that a problem? I shot back, trying to stand my ground. But even to me, I sounded unsure. The next morning, when I went to get dressed, my skirt and half my wardrobe was gone. Panic hit me like a wave, making my head spin. I found Chris in the kitchen, calmly making coffee like nothing had happened. Where are my clothes, Chris? I asked, my voice shaking. I demanded answers, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. I sounded like a stranger, not a wife. They weren't appropriate. I did us both a favor, Chris said, his tone oddly calm, as if he were talking about the weather instead of my clothes. A favor? By deciding what I can and can't wear? Do you hear yourself? I asked, my disbelief clear in my voice. It's for the best, Erica. You'll thank me later, he said, like he knew better than me. His words made my skin crawl. That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't concern, it was control. My independence, my choices. He was chipping away at them bit by bit, trying to mold me into someone smaller, someone easier to control. I sat at the kitchen table, his words echoing in the silence. My home, once warm and loving, felt different now. It wasn't a safe place anymore. It was a beautifully decorated prison, and Chris was the warden. The rest of the day was a blur. At work, I went through the motions, smiling when I had to, but inside, I felt like a storm was brewing. I spent hours staring at the pictures on my phone, family photos where Chris looked like the perfect husband. Now they felt like someone else's life, like I didn't recognize the woman in them. That evening, I sat in my car outside the house, the engine humming softly. I didn't want to go inside. It took all my strength to turn the key and step through the door. The smell of dinner hit me, and there was Chris, smiling and kissing me like it was just another day. But it wasn't. And the saddest part? I didn't know if tomorrow would be any different. At work the next day, my boss, Mr. Andrew, dropped a thick file on my desk. Got a new project for you, Erica. It'll mean some late nights, but you're the best for the job. Of course, Mr. Andrew. Happy to help, I said, forcing a smile, even though my stomach sank at the thought. That night at dinner, I told Chris about the project. His fork clattered against his plate as his eyes narrowed. You'll quit, he said, his voice sharp and cold. Chris, quitting isn't that simple, I replied, trying to stay calm. I'm good at my job, and we need the money. I tried to reason with him, hoping he'd understand, but his fists clenched on the table, and his anger was clear as day. No wife of mine is going to slave away for some boss, he almost shouted. That's when his mother, Kate, showed up like always, right on cue, her hands trembling with worry. Erica, honey, she said, her hands fluttering nervously. Can't you just ease up a bit for Chris? It wasn't right. None of it. But I had loved him once, and part of me still held on to that. So I tried to meet him halfway. What if I work from home? Best of both worlds, right? I offered. Chris leaned back in his chair, his face relaxing just a little. Fine, he muttered, but he added, no late nights. Kate smiled, her pale eyes meeting mine like she was silently thanking me. But inside, I felt trapped. The walls around me were painted by Chris's anger and framed by Kate's constant worry. As weeks went by, my home office became my whole world. Chris would occasionally peek over my shoulder, and Kate would call in the afternoons to check in, or maybe check up on me. It was hard to tell. Either way, I felt like I was on a short leash. Work kept me busy enough to push the darker thoughts away. My boss, Mr. Andrew, was tough but fair. "You're holding everything together, Erica," he said during one of our phone calls. "Keep it up." One evening, as the sun set and turned the sky a tired shade of blue, Chris was on the couch, flipping through channels but not really watching. I closed my laptop, my brain fried from a long day of work. "Work's done for now," I said, my voice worn out. He grunted, a sound that wasn't a yes or a no, just Chris's way of saying he heard me. I sat down next to him, the cushion sinking under me like my tired bones. Out of nowhere, he said, "You've been talking to Andrew a lot about work." "Yes, it's work, Chris," I said, keeping my eyes on the TV, trying to avoid an argument. He hummed, a sound I knew too well. It was that familiar signal that his mind was working, probably on something I wouldn't like. That was life with Chris. My love for him felt like a blindfold getting tighter. Every step forward felt like 3 steps back. The woman I saw in the mirror was starting to feel like a stranger. Her eyes were full of questions I was too scared to answer. One day, I needed a ride, and Grandma's place was too far to walk. I took a taxi home, just a regular ride with a regular driver. He dropped me off, and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Chris was outside waiting for me, and as soon as he saw me step out of the taxi, he lost it. The driver had barely handed me my change when Chris stormed over. "What's going on here? Who's this?" he snapped, his eyes wide with anger. "Chill out, Chris. He's just a taxi driver," I said, trying to calm him down, but Chris wouldn't listen. The driver, seeing trouble, didn't waste a second. He jumped back in his car and drove off. Smart move. Once we were inside, Chris was still pacing, throwing angry looks my way. "Really, Chris? You're freaking out over nothing," I said, exhausted by the drama. "It's not nothing. Who knows what you were doing in there?" he shouted, his voice booming in the small entryway. I rolled my eyes. "Get over yourself." Things eventually settled down, but it didn't last. A couple of days later, while I was making dinner, I caught Chris snooping through my phone. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I snapped, grabbing my phone out of his hands. He trailed off, looking guilty, like a kid caught stealing cookies. "Do you mind telling me what's so interesting about my phone?" I asked, completely fed up. Chris rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know. I was just checking on you. Making sure you're not hiding anything." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Checking on me? Are you serious right now? You think that's okay?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed. "I'm sorry, all right? I won't do it again." "You're right, you won't, because this is ridiculous. You're acting crazy," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Look," Chris said, his voice softer now. "I messed up. Forgive me, okay?" I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. I was mad, sure, but not mad enough to end everything. Not yet. "Fine," I said, "but this is it, Chris. No more acting like a jealous kid. You need to get it together." He nodded quickly, almost too eager. "Yeah, of course. I promise." I let it go, hoping things would get better. Deep down, I knew it was a long shot, but I still wanted to believe. Sometimes that's what we do. We see the warning signs but keep ignoring them, hoping the road will somehow lead somewhere else. It all started one cool morning when I noticed a car. It was a plain, dark sedan, parked on the next street over. It looked a little too clean and stayed a little too long, but I shrugged it off. Probably just visiting someone, I thought. But then I saw it again at the grocery store, parked a couple of aisles over. And again, near the dry cleaners. Same car, same feeling. It was like a bad penny that kept showing up. After a week of this, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was off. One day, when the car followed me to the library, I decided to test it. I took a different route home, turning here and there to see if it would follow.
It did.
The sedan matched my turns, keeping its distance but always there. When I parked on a side street, it stopped just a little way behind me. This wasn't a coincidence. It's strange how your mind doesn't want to believe something's wrong, even when it's obvious. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a cheap detective show, but my heart was racing. Fear and anger bubbled up inside me. I grabbed my phone and whispered, "I think I'm being followed," as if the guy in the car could hear me. The police took me seriously. They arrived quickly, talked to the man in the car, checked his ID, and then confirmed my fears. The guy was a private detective, hired to follow me. By the time I got home, I was shaking. The police report was clutched in my hand as I walked through the door. Chris was lounging on the couch like it was any other night, looking completely unaware that his little game had been exposed. "Chris," I shouted, throwing the door open harder than I meant to. "What the hell is this?" He jumped up, startled, his eyes darting around like they always did when he was caught off guard. "Erica, a private detective, Chris?" I said, my voice trembling. "You had me followed?" He started stammering, his face red and guilty. "Don't," I said, cutting him off and holding up my hand. "Just don't." I didn't want to hear any excuses or lies. "You know what? I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice shaking. But I pulled myself together. "You need to leave, Chris." His mouth opened like he was going to argue, but then he stopped. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and walked out. For the first time in years, I was alone. But instead of feeling scared, I felt relief. It was the first honest moment I'd had in a long time. That day started off strange. The house was quieter now that Chris was gone. He was many things, but quiet wasn't one of them. The peace was nice, but it also felt a little eerie. Then there was a knock at the door, shattering the silence like a dropped plate. Standing there was Mr. John, Chris's boss. He was medium height, always looked stiff, like he starched his face along with his shirts. I never liked him much. Today, he was holding a folder stuffed with papers. "He's not here," I said before he could come inside. Mr. John frowned, probably not used to people not opening their doors wide for him. "I've got some important work documents for him." I sighed. If Chris got $1 every time he was called important, we'd be living in a mansion. Well, he's not here. I can give them to him when he comes back. Mr. John thought for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose. Can I come in for a moment? I've been driving for hours." I noticed his car parked outside. It was as fancy and polished as his suit, shiny black and spotless. "Sure, why not?" I said, stepping aside. I waved toward the kitchen. "Take a seat. Want some tea?" He plopped down in the chair like a sack of flour, looking tired, maybe from the drive, maybe from life. Hard to tell. "Tea would be good." "Thank you, Erica." I put the kettle on and scooped tea leaves into the pot. Old habits die hard. I used to like being the perfect hostess. That's when I saw it through the kitchen window. Flames. Fire was dancing around Mr. John's car like it was celebrating something. I shoved the half-made tea toward Mr. John. "Your car," I said, rushing outside. We bolted out the door, and there he was, Chris, my estranged husband, standing by the burning car with a grin that made my stomach turn. He looked like it was his birthday, and someone had brought him a surprise cake. His eyes glinted with the same craziness as the flames. Mr. John froze, then blurted out, "My car? What the hell is going on?" Chris turned to us, his smile twitching. "Hey, Erica. This is for stealing my life. Say hello to your lover." His words slurred with some twisted satisfaction, mixed with pure insanity. He actually thought he was getting revenge on some imaginary lover of mine. Mr. John stood there, his face shifting from shock to rage. "Chris, did you do this?" Chris's grin disappeared as fast as ice cream on a hot day when he realized who Mr. John was. His boss.
His mistake.
"Boss, I didn't know," Chris stammered. Mr. John cut him off. "You set my car on fire thinking it belonged to who?" "God, Chris. I had the contract renewal papers with me." "Well, guess what? Consider them and your job ashes. You're done." Chris dropped to his knees like a sack of bricks, pleading. "Please, Mr. John, Save it," Mr. John said coldly. I'm calling the police. The sirens didn't take long. The street filled up quickly. Neighbors, cops, and even some people holding up their phones, recording like we were some cheap reality shows. The cops slapped cuffs on Chris's wrists while he was still on his knees, his pants dusty from the driveway. I felt a weight lift off me as they hauled him away. One fire's out, but I knew I still had a mess to clean up. Mr. John just shook his head at what used to be his shiny black car, now reduced to a smoldering wreck. The last I saw of Chris, he was trying to look back at me over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic. When I stepped back into my living room, everything felt strange. The whole ordeal with Chris was finally ending. The divorce papers had been filed, and I told him to stay away, but he clearly didn't listen. Now, with jail time on the horizon for burning his boss's car and stalking me, it was over. Mr. John wasn't letting it slide either. He fired Chris and hit him with a lawsuit. Standing there, I couldn't help but feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. Erica, honey? Grandma Marianne called from the kitchen. Do you need anything? I took a deep breath.
No, Grandma.
I'm good. I shook my head as I walked into the kitchen to see Grandma Marianne. She had a way of cutting straight through the nonsense. Gran, I'm good, I said, pausing. But I should have listened to you about Chris. She turned around from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel. Oh, honey, when will you learn to trust this? She said, patting her belly with a little chuckle. I couldn't help but laugh. She always kept it real. Can't argue with Grandma's gut, I said with a smile. Later, I sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine without really reading it. It was just something to do. For the first time in months, I felt sure I'd made the right decision. There was still a lot to handle, lawyers, sorting out the mess Chris left, figuring out money, but tonight it was just me. I pulled out my phone and texted Olivia, my best friend since forever.
Free.
Finally. Want to come over and crash my solo party? It didn't take long for her to reply. On my way. Bringing pizza. The rest of the night was going to be simple, no drama, no Chris. Just pizza, bad TV shows, and good company. I changed into my comfiest sweatpants and pulled my hair back, finally able to breathe. The future wasn't totally clear yet, but it already looked a lot better than my past. I smiled to myself, thinking how nice it felt to have no strings attached. No more walking on eggshells. This was how life was going to be from now on, starting now. I locked the door behind me, feeling the new locks click into place. Freedom tasted a lot like pepperoni and cheese tonight, and that was just fine by me.